Okay, so great. Our next session is teaching R to yourself and others. First off, we have David Kais, who's giving the talk, How to Convince Your Teammates to Learn R, a problem I personally dealt with too. So thank you. Thank you.
Great. Just this. Thanks, everybody. I'm David Kais. I run R for the Rest of Us. R for the Rest of Us is a company. We do work in a couple different areas, a lot of training. That's actually what most people know us for. Have online courses, cohort-based courses, do trainings for organizations. And then we also do consulting work where people come to us and ask us to do, it's primarily around reports. We do a lot of parameterized reporting. So in this talk today, I'm going to draw from my experience on both ends of our business, but probably more on the education side of things. So you're here on a Saturday morning. I clearly don't need to convince you to learn R. You're obviously excited about it. But it can be hard if you're an R user to watch other people struggle, to do things in other tools when you know if you switch to R, if you learn R, you can do that so much easier. And it can be especially challenging when those people are your teammates, right? Like you want to sit next to them and just show them, hey, you can do this in R, it'll save you a ton of time. So I'm going to talk to you today about how you can convince your teammates to learn R. Now, I'm focusing primarily on the types of people that I have worked with. So these are people usually coming from another tool like Excel or SPSS, SAS, data. If you are trying to convince, say, a Python user to come to R, this might be a little bit less relevant. You're probably going to want to use some different strategies. So just keep that in mind as I'm talking. So why should you trust me? I started R for the Rest of Us in 2019. Since then, I've worked with thousands of people, not directly. I say thousands because I've made online courses that thousands of people have taken. I've also worked with dozens of teams who have switched from some other tool, again, primarily like Excel, SPSS, to R. And what I've seen in this work is that people are really reluctant to switch to R. And again, like I know that can be kind of hard to imagine for those of us who love R, but it's true, people are really reluctant. And so I'm going to try and give you a look inside the minds of your teammates who are reluctant to learn R, and I'm going to do that with 4 lessons. So, lesson number 1. Nobody wants to learn R. And what I mean by that is a few different things. First of all, people oftentimes think that R will just be a direct replacement for whatever tool they're using now. So for me, for example, when I learned R, I was an Excel user. I made a lot of data visualization, and I was like, well, I hear R can make good data visualization. Let me switch to R, and I can, instead of using Excel for my data viz, can do my data viz in R. And of course, what I found out as I got into R is that R can do the things that I was doing in Excel, but it also opened up a whole world for me in terms of automation, that type of thing that I hadn't been able to do in a point-and-click tool like Excel. So I think it's really important to be able to articulate some of the things that you can do in R that are actually not possible in whatever tool people are coming from. The other thing I think it's really important to acknowledge is that R is scary. And especially for people who have never done any kind of programming before, learning a tool like R is a really scary, intense experience. And if you think about it, it's scary, especially if you've never programmed, because not only are people having to learn a new software tool, right? They're having to switch from Excel to working in RStudio, say, but they're also having to learn programming at the same time. And so I think it's really important to be able to acknowledge that for people and say, hey, like, I know this is scary. I remember when it was scary for me too. And I think having that empathy can go a long way in terms of people being willing to go along with you. The other thing that I find, especially for people starting out, and if you can kind of get people, into R and starting to learn it, is that early on, it can be really confusing because if you ask, how should I do this in R? And if you Google or get on Stack Overflow or something like that, there are a lot of different ways that you can do any single task. And I see this show up when people teach newcomers. A lot of times they'll talk about, well, you can do this in base R and here's the syntax, or you can do this with a tidyverse approach and here's the syntax. And for people who are just starting out, it might seem like you're doing them a service by showing them multiple approaches, but my experience has been that that's actually more confusing for people. Because think about what you're forcing them to do. You're forcing them to learn not just one syntax, but two different syntaxes. And you're forcing them to evaluate which of these syntaxes is better, which one should I use? And that's a lot, especially remember if it's someone who's never programmed before, think about all the cognitive load that you're putting on them. So my approach in my teaching has been to choose just one approach. I'm a huge fan of the tidyverse. I think for most people starting out, it's way easier than learning with base R. The fact that functions have nice names, summarize, filter, it's easy to know what's going on. It's designed in a more intuitive way for most newcomers has been my experience than base R. But whichever approach you take, my recommendation is that you choose one and stick to it. Lesson number 2, nobody cares about R. Again, you're here on a Saturday, you care about R, but other people don't. What they care about is what you can do with R. So they care about the ends, not the means. So the idea of saying like, hey, you should learn to use R, it's really fun. Like I love programming every day. That's probably not going to resonate with people. Instead, if you can talk about what they can do with R, that's going to resonate a lot better. And the way I like to do this is to really focus on one pain point. So if you can identify one thing that people are trying to do in whatever software they're using, that's really a pain for them, and you can talk about how you can do that more efficiently in R, that's going to go a long way. So the example that I like to give a lot of times when I'm talking to people who are considering R is the idea of parameterized reporting, which Isabella mentioned briefly. If you're not familiar, parameterized reporting is the idea of making a document either in R Markdown or in Quarto that's sort of like a template. And then you write a separate R script file that iterates over that and makes multiple reports. So for example, in our consulting work, we do a lot of like state level reporting or county level reporting, and we'll make one report for every state or one report for every county within a state. Before I started R for the Rest of Us, I worked at a foundation in Portland called the Oregon Community Foundation. We give out grants to nonprofits across the state. I had to produce reports for those grantees, and I did that manually. I was using Excel. I'd make the chart, copy it into Word, and then add some text and save that. If someone had come to me at that time and said, hey, you can automate this process if you learn R with parameterized reporting, that would have gone a long way. And so being able to observe and identify what's one pain point is a really good way to help people consider switching to R. I also recommend keeping it simple. So for, I said just a second ago to focus on one pain point. It can be really easy to get excited about all the different things you can do with R. So, it can be easy to say, well, if you learn R, you can do this and this and this and this. And the problem, just like the kind of multiple approach idea that I talked about before, the problem if you share kind of multiple things that people can do is it's hard for them to like think about all those things and keep them kind of in their mind at the same time. So rather than focusing on multiple things that people can do with R, focusing on one thing and keeping it simple is a much better approach. Lesson number 3, don't be condescending. And I say that because unfortunately, nobody in this room, of course, but unfortunately, you will see people who will say, oh, I'm an R user, like why would anybody use Excel or SPSS or SAS or Stata or whatever other tool? Couple things. First of all, R may not be the best tool for everyone. And the example I like to give is sometimes I'll talk to organizations who are considering moving to R, and I'll say, okay, why do you want to move to R? And they'll say, well, we want our people to be able to engage more with data. And I say to them, well, if you want people to engage more with data, they don't have to use R for that. Maybe an advanced Excel training that'll allow them to engage with their data more is going to be a better approach. And so I think really considering that context and thinking about what people want to do before you push R on them is really important. Actually, that's what I just mentioned. So if you want to have less technical people engage with data, for example, Excel might be better. Don't talk down about other tools. This is what I mentioned before. And the reason why, first of all, it's just not a nice thing to do. But second of all, I actually think it forces people to push back. And so if you tell people, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're using Excel or SPSS or whatever other tool. In the mind of that person, they're thinking, well, I've been using whatever tool for 10, 15 years, and I've made my career on it. Why is this person disparaging the work that I've done and made my career on? So while it can be tempting to say like, oh, R is just way better, if you put down other tools, it's going to make people actually not want to switch to R. Lesson 4, last lesson. Cost is what's going to bring people in. You probably know this. The fact that R is free is a big deal for people. And everyone thinks, oh, great, I can learn R and then I'll never have to pay for software again. So my recommendation is to use cost as a Trojan horse. Right? There's no costs to using R except for your time. So great, let's get R in the door. And so use that to your advantage. But ultimately, the fact that R is free is not enough to keep people using it. And so I think really efficiency and showing people the value of R is what's going to keep them using it. So just to sum up, nobody wants to learn R. People think it's just going to be a replacement for their current tool. They find it scary. And so and they get confused when you give them multiple approaches. Nobody cares about R. So instead, focus on the end result of what you can do with R rather than the tool itself. Focusing on one pain point, like I mentioned, is really effective. Don't be condescending. Consider the context. Consider whether R is in fact the right tool. And don't talk down about tools. And finally, use the fact that R is free as a Trojan horse to get it in the door, but ultimately you'll need to show the value of it in order for it to stick.